To our Commitment 2026 coverage tonight, there are 4 candidates running to represent California's 8th Congressional District. It covers voters in parts of Solano County and the Bay Area. I spoke to each of them about key issues you care about, from affordability to the housing market. Here's the leading candidates for the 8th Congressional District. Incumbent Congressman John Garamendi is seeking re-election. The former California Lieutenant Governor has served 8 terms in Congress and is the top Democrat on the House Armed and Services Subcommittee on Readiness. Nicola Carjuzza is a former international financial regulatory analyst working in the intersection of finance and regulation. Aaron Rowden has experience as a political analyst for a Bay Area public health nonprofit. We start with a look at affordability and access to affordable housing.
We need a vibrant and, frankly, affordable rental market that's stable. I would also propose that people who are renting, provided that they are living up to the obligations of their agreements, that they are paying their rent, should have a modicum of due process to make sure that they can't just be kicked out when somebody comes in with a better offer. I would look at a new federal law to create a process where people who are renting, they're going month to month in good faith, really can't just be removed from their home for no reason or any reason because somebody wants to make a little bit more money.
One, you got to have a job. So there's a whole employment thing that we've been working on. We'll talk about that, I suppose. But also the housing. About 5 years ago now, I introduced a bill called the Homes Act, which is an update of the federal low income and moderate income housing program, which has not been updated since 1994. And these are grants to build the houses, to build the low income houses, also rent payment assistance, and other kinds of programs to assist in the construction of new housing and also the rehabilitation of existing housing.
It is a big issue. It's one that I face personally, that many Americans of all generations are facing. What I will say is that our financial system isn't built to support affordable housing either. So we need to subsidize affordable housing. That can be done through public investment. It can be done through a bill to channel billions, and actually trillions of dollars are needed to close the housing gap in America. But we need the financial system to play a part in that too. If the financial system is built to securitize housing, to make sure that investors get their share of the profit in terms of housing development, in terms of the values of homes, then we're putting good money after bad money. To fix the housing crisis in America, we need to treat it like a public infrastructure problem.
We talk about affordability, grocery prices, the cost of gas, especially with the war in Iran. Gas prices have soared across the state. What is your plan to tackle that in Congress if reelected?
Well, we've got a very, very serious problem. It's called Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in his trade wars, when he went after the tariff issues, put in place extraordinary increases in the cost of everything. And now the Iran war on top of that, it is an intolerable situation that Trump has created all by himself. So what to do about it? Fight fiercely in Congress to end this war. The Iran war is an absolute and unnecessary war. It's costing the taxpayers out of the taxpayer pockets, but out of the consumer pockets also.
It's largely a commuter population. A lot of people spend almost an hour every day commuting, paying tolls, paying for gas. It's how people get to work, it's how they make their livelihoods, and it's at a huge cost to them. So the way we need to fix that is by ending the war in Iran. We need to stabilize gas prices around the world. And in fact, it's a good indication of where the world is going in terms of energy. We need to invest in alternative energies that we can sustain, that we can put to work, and get Americans to work, closer to work. I think it's important to make sure that people can live closer to their work. We can add public transportation. We can build infrastructure to support that.
First and foremost, we have to end this patently illegal military operation in Iran. I think we need to go line by line to our agricultural policies and really see why are we incentivizing higher prices and price shocks as opposed to price stability. Are we incentivizing people to grow, or are we incentivizing people to collect subsidy? And I think that we really do need to go thoroughly through our policies and make sure that we are both producing food and distributing it. I am very much in favor of the government creating the ability to bring food to market, not just to create something, but to also bring it to the marketplace so that people can actually buy it.
The conversation about clean air, climate change. What is your plan, if elected to Congress, to address those concerns that some people have, especially being near those refineries?
Look at Richmond. For decades, children there have suffered with higher rates of asthma than in other places, right? And that's a direct result of being closer to the refinery. Now, the issue is making sure that we also allow those refineries to make the investments that we expect of them, so there can't be a gap between the rules that we write for them and allowing them to permit, to make sure that those projects can actually be invested in, they can do that. There's a balance there. But more importantly, I think we do need to get off of fossil fuels. We just get rid of the entire problem when we invest in renewable sources. I don't think the market can respond to it on its own. It'll take a federal hand in helping it.
I'm still young enough to inherit the world that will be created in the next 20 years and, God willing, the next 40 years. I want to live in that world with my children and my children's children as long as possible. And that is only going to happen if we start focusing on the environmental impact of how we live a good life. And I think it is very important that our federal policy focus on making sure that the means by which we survive is the means by which future generations can also survive and thrive.
I'll do what I've done for 52 years. In 1974, I introduced the very first tax credit for solar, wind, and conservation. 1976, Jerry Brown signed that bill. I've been at this a long, long time on renewable energy. We've continued to push that. In fact, one of the renewable energy plants, a solar program, is still operating in the California desert. It is 50 years old now. So what do we do now? We just hunker down, hang on as best we can to what we have put in place.
And there are a total of 4 candidates in the race to represent District 8. The Democrat Nicholas Carjuza, Representative John Garamendi, and Aaron Rowden. Now, I reached out to Republican Rudy Rosilli several times to set up an interview, but did not hear back. Our KCRA 3 voter guide is online. You can scan the QR code on your screen to check it out. It includes a look at who's running for the top statewide offices and the congressional districts. All that and more is available right now on the KCRA 3 app.